This is How Sex Drives Evolution by Brian Morris. Most sexually reproducing species show dramatic physiological differences between the males and the females. These differences are called sexual dimorphisms. In the male of the species, often very curious structures are present that seem to serve no function at all to assist the survival of the organism. For example, the peacock's tail, the songs frogs sing to each other, and the enormous heavy horns of the elk. These curious adaptations must be maladaptive, as they seem to violate evolutionary theory. The large tail of the peacock must make it difficult to fly away from predators, and bright colors or markings must surely paint a target for predators that says, "Here I am, come and eat me." One would think that natural selection would have weeded out all these structures by now. But that has not happened. These maladaptive structures seem to be fixed within the species as they're present in every male of the population. Besides making oneself an easy target for predators, these seemingly maladaptive structures must cost a lot of energy to create and maintain. And when it comes to survival, food energy is everything. Wouldn't it be better to grow a large pair of claws for defense instead of a cumbersome ornament? Also, it is only the males that seem to possess these unusual traits, while the females remain rather small and plain. Perhaps it could be that the females are saving their energy for something else and more important. It would make sense that natural selection would be partial towards organisms that make the most efficient use of their energy, and would select for organisms that are the best at escaping predation. Yet it would seem that in many species, maladaptive ornamental traits are somehow being selected for, despite their obvious disadvantages for the survival of the individual bearing them. It would then seem that there must be another type of selection at play here. Sexual selection is selection for an individual that increases the organism's chances of successfully getting a mate. Selection is not always strictly about survival of the individual organism. It is also about proliferation of the species and successfully passing your genes onto the next generation, hopefully increasing their frequency in the gene pool as much as possible. Maladaptive traits like the peacock's feathers can actually be seen as an advantage if the diminished survival of the peacock is offset by increased reproduction. There would seem to be a trade-off between survival and reproduction. If you think about it, if every organism of a species is individually very good at surviving, but hardly ever creates any offspring, the species as a whole will suffer and their numbers would diminish. On the other hand, if organisms can trade some of their survivability in favor of increasing their reproductive output, the species will increase in number and flourish. So then, how do maladaptive traits get selected for? There are two types of selection, or two ways: male versus male selection, or male competition, and female choosiness. Between males of a species, there is a sort of arms race to grow larger horns or bigger tusks as they fight with each other, the winner getting to mate with the female. Selection chooses the traits of the victorious male, usually the male with the biggest tusks or horns, or the most vigorous display. Therefore, ever bigger armaments in males will propagate throughout the gene pool. The other type of selection is called female choice. With female choice, the male versus male competition is less direct, and the females will decide who gets to mate with them. Males will line up, often literally, and present themselves before the females of the species, and, so to speak, strut their stuff. The female will then choose a winner to mate with. This is where the peacock's tail comes from. Female peacocks will choose the male with the biggest and fanciest tail display to mate with. In some frog and bird species, the female will choose the male with the longest or the loudest and most appealing songs. So, a large fancy peacock tail may make it really not very good at escaping predation, and frogs may be giving away their position to predators when they sing their songs, but the organism that mates more and has a shorter lifespan is in a way more fit than the longer-lived one who dies a bachelor. Traits that are maladaptive to the individual organism's longevity are actually an advantage in light of reproductive fitness. This is why unusual behaviors and ornamental structures that are energy expensive and bad for survival evolve and become fixed in the gene pool. There is a balance, though, in this trade-off. Why don't we see elk with 50-foot long horns or peacocks with tails the size of a skyscraper? It's because the organism needs to survive long enough to mate. An organism who lives 5 years and mates successfully once a year will fare better than an organism of the same species who lives 10 years but only mates once. It will also fare better than an organism who lives 1 year but mates 4 times. Maladaptive ornamental traits and behaviors reach a balancing point when lifetime reproductive output is maximized. If a peacock with a 100-foot tall tail ever did exist, it would probably not live long enough to pass that tail on. Sex is energy expensive and risky. Lots of energy is spent on dimorphic traits or vigorous displays shown to females, and lots of time and energy are devoted to the act itself. Not to mention, doing the deed may leave one exposed to predators in the meanwhile. So, somehow, it all must be well worth it. This brings us to recombination. With sex, you get meiosis, and meiosis means recombination, crossing over, and ultimately, lots of variation. Recombination can be pretty cool. It can group advantageous alleles together on the same chromosomes, and at the same time, kick off a not-so-advantageous allele. Separation of a bad allele, always linked with a good one, breaks linkage disequilibrium. 2 bad alleles can also be linked together, though. This can be a good thing, though, since the inheritor of a bad allele combination may not live long enough to pass it on. This is the idea of a genetic scapegoat. Creating new allele combinations can accelerate a species' adaptation to a very challenging or always changing environment. So, despite its high cost, sex can be very adaptive for a species. The strategical differences between males and females may all arise simply from the size of their gametes. Males are cheap, so to speak, producing large quantities of small sperm that function basically as DNA donators. Females, however, only produce a few larger gametes that are very expensive to care for, and they need to grow them into a new organism. Females invest way more into their gametes than males do, and only have a small number of them to work with, so they must make each opportunity count. Females then choose the best possible male or DNA donator, and males must compete for a limited number of female gametes to fertilize. This is why males have arms races and ornamental structures. They need to win a female. A tendency towards maladaptive sexually dimorphic traits and behaviors is driven by sexual selection. These maladaptive traits in males somehow must signal to a female that a male will provide benefits another male might not be able to offer. Females benefit by being choosy both directly and indirectly. A direct benefit would be a male with a large amount of territory and/or resources that can be used to raise offspring, or the caregiving provided directly to the offspring by the male. This would all help increase the chances of survival for the offspring. Indirect benefits would be things like good genes that can be passed down to her offspring. Perhaps a female may even choose the male with the best display for no other reason than her male offspring will inherit that display and use it to sire many grandchildren. Colors and displays may also be indicators of good health, including genetic health, an indirect benefit. An unhealthy or malnourished male may not be able to grow or perform a good display, signaling to the female that he probably won't sire any very healthy offspring. The best displays would come from the healthiest males with the best genes. Sex has its costs as well as its advantages. Not all organisms reproduce sexually. Technically, most actually don't. However, it must work quite well, as many species do use this strategy and probably will for a long time to come.